Welcome to this video. Today we're going to take a look at the top 10 tanks of World War II that were the most dominant on the battlefield. Get comfortable, here we go. Number 10. Char B1. The Char B1 was a French heavy tank built in the period before World War II. In 1921, requirements for a new type of heavily armored infantry tank were commissioned in France. This heavy machine was to be designed for breakthrough actions while having high endurance. Series production began in 1934. The armored tanks were virtually indestructible, either German 88mm anti-aircraft guns or bomber aircraft had to intervene. The Char B1 packed some impressive firepower, but was very slow and didn't have a proper radio on board. Number 9. Churchill. The Churchill tank was one of the most widely used British tanks of World War II. The British used a concept based on two categories of tanks: infantry tanks, which were designed to support infantry and attack enemy defensive positions, and cruiser tanks, which were designed to engage enemy armored vehicles. Infantry tanks had weaker armament but powerful passive protection. The crew of a Churchill tank was 5 soldiers per vehicle. The Churchill infantry tanks were first deployed into combat on August 19, 1942 during the Allied diversionary action at Dieppe, France, and were also used on the African battlefield, particularly during the fighting in Tunisia. However, armament with a 6-pounder gun optimized for combat against armored targets was inadequate, so tankers mounted 75mm guns from damaged American tanks on them as an emergency measure, capable of firing the more effective 3-round burst ammunition against unarmored targets. Number 8. M3 Stuart. The M3 Stuart was an American light tank used during World War II by the American, British and other Allied armies. After the outbreak of World War II, the U.S. began a large-scale modernization of its military. In the early 1940s, it was decided to produce a new type that would be based on the M2 tank. It was to have a new turret, reinforced armor and a better suspension chassis. The development was short-lived. Already in July of the same year this new tank was accepted into service under the designation M3. The M3 did not enter series production until March 1941, and its first combat deployment took place in November of that year with the British Army, where it was supplied under the Lend-Lease program. The vehicle used in the fighting for the port city of Tobruk. The first combat deployment in the United States Army took place in a fighting for the Philippines, in early 1942. Another purchaser of M3 tanks was the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program. Even Red Army officials were not enthusiastic about this machine because of its poor armament and armor. Number 7. IS-2. The IS-2, originally IS-122, was a Soviet heavy tank developed in 1943 and used during and after World War II. The designation IS stood for Iosif Stalin. Simultaneously with the construction of the IS-1 prototype, further development was initiated to arm this tank with a more powerful gun that would allow it to not only destroy new enemy heavy tanks, but to gain superiority over them. From the beginning, IS tanks were assigned only to separate guard heavy tank regiments. These regiments were incorporated into separate tank brigades in early 1945. IS-2 tanks were a great asset in fighting the new generation of German tanks, as they possessed strong passive protection, and on the other hand great firepower. Thanks to the 122mm caliber gun, they could destroy virtually any enemy tank, which was not the case the other way around. Perhaps their most famous deployment was the Battle of Sandomierz, where they clashed with the latest German Tiger II tanks. Number 6. Tiger I. The Tiger I was a German heavy tank developed during World War II that was deployed in Africa and Europe from 1942, usually in independent heavy tank battalions. The tank performed very successfully in the fighting at Kharkov in the spring of 1943. As the Tigers became increasingly active in combat, they began to suffer losses due to mines, hits, terrain obstacles and mechanical failures. A variety of tankers, tank aces, emerged among the German soldiers, destroying dozens of enemy tanks, and fighting vehicles with their Tiger machines. While the Tiger I was hailed as an excellent design in its day, it was overbuilt using expensive materials and labor-intensive manufacturing methods. It was also susceptible to certain types of chassis failures and malfunctions, and its range was limited by its high fuel consumption. Maintenance was expensive but generally mechanically reliable. The surrender of the German army in May 1945 also marked the end of the Tiger tank, which had become a true symbol of German military power, and which in many respects foreshadowed the development of modern tanks. Number 5. Panzer IV. The Panzer IV was a German medium tank, the first variants of which were developed from 1933 in Germany as a medium tank for infantry support. The first prototypes were built in late 1935–1936, and were used throughout World War II. Originally, the Panzer IV tank was designed to support attacking infantry, while the Panzer III was intended to fight enemy armored vehicles. In the first variants of the Panzer IV, the main weapon was a short 75 mm gun, 7.5 cm KWK 37 L/24, but this was not ideal for fighting enemy armored vehicles. Since the Panzer III tank did not allow for the installation of a suitably powerful armament, and the development of new types would be lengthy, this left only the Panzer IV tank, which was quickly armed with a long 75 mm gun. Production of the first F2 tanks began in March 1942. The tanks continued to be used after World War II. They were used, for example, by the Czechoslovak Army and the French Army, which then sold the decommissioned tanks to Syria, which deployed them against Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967. Number 4. M4 Sherman Firefly. The Sherman Firefly tank was a British version of the American M4 Sherman tank. Unlike the original, it was armed with the British QF 17-pounder gun of 76.2 mm caliber. The most common power plant was a Chrysler multi-bank engine. The Sherman Firefly was developed in response to a British cabinet request to fit a more effective gun to one of the existing tank types. The reason for such a request was the negative experience of fighting in North Africa and Italy in 1942–43. The new German tanks with long 75 mm, Panzer IV, Panther, and 88 mm, Tiger I, guns inflicted heavy losses on British armored units, and were themselves virtually immune, Tiger, to British tank fire. The development of a new tank would have been too lengthy, and so resort was made to installing the proven 17-pounder anti-tank gun on the existing tank type. First the Cromwell tank was modified, but the Challenger version was not successful. In late 1943, a trial conversion of the Sherman V tank proved satisfactory, and a production order was quickly placed for 700 of the much-needed units for the upcoming invasion of Western Europe. During an attack on Neuilly-en-Bessin on June 9, 1944, a Canadian officer quickly knocked out 5 German Panthers using only 6 rounds of his Firefly's main gun. Number 3. M4 Sherman. The M4 Sherman was the most famous American tank in World War II and shortly after. It was named by the British military after the American General Sherman. With nearly 50,000 units produced, it was the second most numerous tank of the war, surpassed only by the Russian T34. In addition to its deployment in the U.S. Armed Forces, it was supplied to other powers resisting Germany under a loan and lease program. More than a third of all Shermans produced went to the British Army, 4,000 to the Soviet Union. At the time of the early fighting, the Sherman was better armed and armored than any German tank, and remained effective against the most common Panzer IV and Stug III machines until the end of the war, but was no match for the enemy's heaviest tanks. The Sherman's combat debut was the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, where they performed well against German and Italian tanks. As America's most numerous tank, it fought on all fronts of the war, seeing important service in the liberation of France and Benelux and the Battle of the Bulge. Shermans remained in the American arsenal long after World War II. Number 2. T-34. The T-34 was a Soviet medium tank developed in the late 1930s and early 1940s that had a major and lasting impact on tank design. At the time of its creation in 1940, it was the best medium tank in the world, according to American author Steven Zaloga. It possessed an unprecedented combination of firepower, mobility, protection, and ruggedness. Its 76.2 mm rapid-firing tank gun provided significantly more firepower than some of its contemporaries. Its sloping armor made it difficult for the most advanced anti-tank weapons of the time to penetrate. Its design allowed for continuous improvements to meet the evolving needs of the Eastern Front. Changes were rather partial and not very significant for the first few years, with the tank undergoing a truly major transformation only in 1944 with the introduction of the T34/85 variant. Improvements in production methods also enabled faster and cheaper production. T-34 variants were widely exported after World War II, and even as late as around 2010 there were limited deployments on the front in several developing countries. Number 1. Panther. The Panther was a German tank produced between 1943 and 1945. It was the German response to the Soviet E-34/76 tank. It outclassed it both in armor strength, and especially in performance and accuracy of the 7.5 cm KWK 42-liter/70 gun, but this lead was soon largely made up by the new E-34/85 version. The Panther is generally regarded as one of the best medium tanks of World War II. Its development began as a result of the German Army's experience on the Eastern Front. There the German tanks encountered the Soviet E-34 medium tanks, and the heavier KV-1, which outclassed the German Panzers in many aspects. As early as June 1942, Albert Speer, the Minister of Economics of the Third Reich, instructed the production of a 250-piece series at the MAN, Daimler-Benz, Henschel and MNH plants. The first production machines reached the units in January 1943. By mid-1943, some 340 Panthers were serving in German units. They were deployed for the first time in the Battle of Kursk, but this was done too early, without proper testing and debugging, so their performance remained far behind expectations. Once early mechanical issues were fixed, the Panther proved to be an effective machine. The 75 mm main gun had excellent range and accuracy, and an experienced crew could fire off 6 rounds a minute. The frontal armor was near impenetrable, but the flanks were vulnerable. Thanks to its speed and maneuverability, those weak sides weren't often exposed. Thank you for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a nice day.